by taking roll call. Go ahead, Wendy.
Nancy Hendrickson, not see. Steve Fancher,
Here.
Eric Mueller,
Here.
Dave Ritma, Seth Reeser,
Here.
Ashton Simpson. Let's see. Lori Stegman is not able to make it. Emerald Bogue.
Jessica Berry is here.
Jennifer Lewis is here. Sorry.
Emerald Bogue will be late. Corky Collier,
Here.
James Allison,
Here, I'm driving home from the office right now. I'll be joining with my camera on in about 20 minutes.
thank you, James. Mary Helen Kincaid,
Here.
Tanny Stephenson,
Here.
Eric Molander,
Here.
Ed Washington, Bob Salinger, Heather King indicated she would be late. I'm only counting 8 board members. That's not a quorum, but I will recheck. Do not currently have a quorum. We can move the minutes vote to later in the meeting if we achieve a quorum, or we could
Yeah.
postpone to next month.
We'll have to postpone the vote on the appointment of the business rep as well. I can get into, I was going to give a brief update of a topic that we covered at the last meeting. And that's board meeting efficiency and logistics. I think most of you that are here today were at that meeting, but a few folks might not have been there. And just wanted to give a really brief recap and remind us at meetings about some of these points that we had discussed last time and had some general agreement around. The first was the formation of a board parking lot, which Wendy has done. And this is just a document. It's just a place, it's like a repository for a little bit harder questions.
We need you to turn your volume off.
Or unmute, put yourself on mute. This would be a repository for kind of bigger questions or data requests so that we can track staff time and efforts, and so that the board also can get answers on this document in a consistent way. The next thing we talked about really was our need to limit the amount of spending from the Urban Flood Safety Water Quality District. We know that we have limited budget, and that was a concern that was expressed by board members during adoption of our annual budget. And a way to do that is to have a little bit less staff attendance at these board meetings, but also to control the amount of research that we're having staff do, and just to be cognizant as a board of what requests we're putting in and how much time some of these data requests take to process and track down. So we need to make sure that we're doing a better job of just tracking and knowing as a board what questions are out there. And that's really the purpose of this board parking lot. On the same vein, I want to do a better job as the board chair of kind of being aware of which questions you guys have as board members. So as I'm helping craft the agenda for future board meetings, I can make sure that we're on track. So if you do have data requests, series of questions for staff, if you could include me, start with me. In fact, I will be your conduit to staff, to Jim, and then Jim to staff for answers into this parking lot. And we'll, I think it's just going to result in a better process all around. Do we have any additional board members that have joined, Wendy?
Yes, Ashton Simpson joined, and we now have a quorum.
Excellent. So we can move ahead with adoption of our meeting minutes from April 5th, the Budget Committee and the work session. And then we also have the April 20th board meeting minutes to adopt. So at this time, hopefully you've seen those, they're in the board packet. I'd entertain a motion if anyone has one to adopt the minutes from those meetings.
I'll just clarify, we made corrections to staff members' titles.
Mr. Chair, I would move to approve, oh, got to turn my mic on, sorry. Mr. Chair, I would move to approve the April 5th, 2023 Budget Committee and work session minutes and the April 20th board meeting minutes as corrected.
Thank you, Eric. We have a motion from Eric Mueller to approve the minutes from the cited meetings. Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, we have a motion from Eric. We have a second from Corky to approve the minutes from the April 5th Budget Committee and work session and the April 20th board meeting. Let's just do a voice vote on this. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously. Thank you. We'll move on now to our next item of business, which is our business representative appointment. And you can find a little more information on this, page 14 and 15 of your board packet, but I'll summarize. Basically, we had some interest expressed from a couple individuals for our open business representative board seat. And Jim and I interviewed both of them. And today I'm here to recommend to the board appointment of this seat to Brent Cartwright. He is the Chief Financial Officer of Diversified Marine Incorporated, which is located in Penn 1. Brent is actually on an airplane right now, so I ideally wanted to introduce him. He was actually at our last meeting, so we got a taste of our board meetings, but we would have loved to introduce him here and have him say a few things about himself. I'll just say I was impressed. He had some very thoughtful questions. He has a lot of experience in the financial sector, which could be beneficial to us. But I want to read a quick quote from the owner of Diversified Marine. Who wrote you'll see on page 15, a letter of recommendation for Brent to be on our board. And just a quick quote. So he says, "Since my business is located on a levee on the Columbia River, I strongly support a flood-ready, equitable, and climate-resilient community, as the vision does not serve an individual interest, but the whole of the community. Many may overlook or take this vision for granted, but I know firsthand a vision like this takes work and action to be realized. A mission and values are guiding principles to a vision. Without dedicated members to support this, a vision is impossible to realize. I am grateful for this opportunity to appoint a member for your position on the board." So with that, before I ask for any kind of motion, just ask if anyone has any questions before we talk about the potential appointment of Mr. Cartwright to this seat.
I just have one. Do we have any kind of rules of how new board members are selected or identified or chosen? I mean, is there anything in our bylaws or whatever you want to call them? I just wondered, because I think it would be an important thing to identify as we go forward, because this is going to go on for 5 years and somebody else might have a different idea of how to do things.
Hong?
Yeah, I'll just take that. At least in statute, the only requirement is that they occupy a certain position that the statute requires. Beyond that, it would be up to the board president and the board members to find qualified candidates.
I know we've had we've been searching for a while to fill this seat, and I know we've had potential candidates we've gone to the stage of trying to set up interviews, and it's just fallen through on us a few times. It's not easy to find someone that's really ready to dive into this really thorny, meaty topic in larger board. So it's just to say it's been challenging. But go ahead, Corky.
Sure, I'll chime in, and Mary Helen, you know this as well as anybody because you have a board you deal with. But from my perspective, I like to be flexible and not have any really hard rules on who's selected for the board. But at the same time, a couple of things I go by is one, don't feel pressure to add a board member. Hopefully, we don't feel that in this case, and find people that are willing to just be really candid with you, that are knowledgeable about the subject, but also will just lay it on the line with you. I don't know Brent, but I have dealt with a few employees from Diversified Marine over the years, and I've found them to be, well, at first, I think I would say I was a little put off in a way, but after a little while, I came to appreciate their candor and and their knowledge. So I look for if Brent's anything like the other people I've worked with at Diversified, I think he'll be a great value to our board.
Thank you, Corky. I know from my perspective as board chair, when we're trying to fill a particular seat, and this happens to be the business representative seat, I'm looking for someone that's not bringing a particular agenda, but is really looking to represent the business community as an owner of a property within the district. So I was convinced. I know I was convinced after interviewing Brent and receiving the letter from Kurt Red, the owner, that that was the case here. So
Thanks. I think
go ahead,
Corky's
Karen.
suggestion of being more flexible is better than having rules that this, and this may happen. Because as we both know, or probably all of us know, being on a board takes a lot of work. And so if somebody's willing to do that, sounds interested, hooray.
Thanks for that, Mary Helen. So at any time, go ahead, Eric.
I was going to say, if you're ready, I would
I am.
move to appoint Ben Cartwright, CFO, Diversified Marine, Inc., to the Urban Flood Safety Water Quality District Initial Board, to the ORS 550-190 subsection 1 subsection N position as a director who represents a private sector business located within the managed floodplain.
Thank you, Eric. We've got a
Second.
motion. Okay, thank you, Eric and Eric. A motion from Eric Mueller to appoint Brent Cartwright into this seat, and a second from Eric Molander. Let's go ahead and do a voice vote, or you
Roll call.
roll call. Yeah, let's do a roll call.
Steve Fancher,
Yes.
Eric Mueller,
Yes.
Seth Reeser,
Yes.
Ashton Simpson,
Yes.
Corky Collier,
Yes.
James Allison,
Yes.
Mary Helen Kincaid,
Yes,
Kenny Stephenson,
Yes.
Eric Molander.
Yes.
9 votes yes, 0 opposed. Motion carries.
Excellent. Thank you. And congratulations to Brent. I know he can't hear us right now, but if he's reviewing the video of the meeting afterwards, thank you for being willing to fill this seat, and welcome aboard. We'll move on now. We're doing well on time, just a little bit ahead of schedule, but I think we're going to jump now to our initial board path to success and year 1 operating revenue needs. And this is myself and Lori Baker. Wendy's going to share a PowerPoint, some slides with you. I'm going to mention as well that I'm going to be at 4 o'clock or around that time, I'm going to be jumping out and still on the meeting, but on my phone, driving down to Eugene for a meeting. And I'll ask at that time, I know James is kind of en route to his home office, but if he's around and can just share with me in the car in that time, it'd be great. If not, I can find somebody else, James.
Yep, I got it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's okay. I can yammer on while you're bringing that up, Wendy.
Are these the slides that were in the packet or are they different?
Slides in the packet.
Oh, okay.
Slides are in the packet, but I'm not finding my Zoom controls. There it is. It's a little tiny window.
I just wanted to, so what I'm attempting to do here is just to give a little bit of an introduction from a board member perspective, to try to, at a high level, just give Lori's presentation a bit of, again, just an introduction. And so I just threw this together, again, just from my own perspective, just kind of summarizing, I think, where I think our proposed path to success is, and just to remind us kind of what our mission as an initial board is. So go ahead, Wendy, flip to the next slide. So this is straight from our legislative language that formed our district, and that's the purpose of the initial district board, us, is to organize the district and develop and approve or seek approval from the electors of methods of funding the operations of the district. Let's stay here for just a second. This is really the only explicit this is the only explicit language you find in our legislative language around what our purpose is. I just want to laser focus and think about that for a second, that we really, as our board, need to be thinking in terms of this statement with regard to just about everything we do. Go ahead, Wendy. So just at a very high level, again, what Lori's going to get into in a second is the operating revenue discussion. So go ahead and click. You'll see here that it means that we're not going to dive into the capital. The capital revenue discussion has to do with the GEO bond. And we've talked about what should possibly be included in the GEO bond. We've started those discussions. But really right now we're going to focus on the operating side. And that's a piece that we've done some initial work on as a board. You've been presented with different pieces of information, and now it's coming back to you with changes from staff. Go ahead. So it might be easier. Could I use this? Click through? Yeah, thank you. There we go. So just again, high level, remind everybody that the operating revenues for the legacy 4 districts have been collected primarily through property assessments via property taxes, so collected through Multnomah County. There are other miscellaneous revenue sources that the legacy districts have, such as charges for services, and we know about payments from the city of Portland. There's others as well, but primarily it's the assessments. Total projected revenue collection for fiscal year 23-24 is $14.4 million. Missing the M there, but you know what I'm talking about. And generally, this is debatable to what degree, and that's why we're here, but it's generally not sufficient to fund the consolidated district, our urban flood safety water quality district operations. And there's a number of reasons for that. Spanning the fact that we have some new service responsibilities. We have to deal with inflation. There are some service gaps that staff's talked to us about. We have new district startup costs that are always going to be there with a new entity. And then there are some GEO bond admin support functions that need to be in the operating, can't be in the capital. You'll also say, yes, there's also a shift in capital, and that's correct. And you're going to see Lori point out some of that and how that saves. Putting some of that cost onto the bond does save on the operating side to some degree. But yeah, so here, levy recertification, new mandates, and we have inadequate investment in our existing district assets we've heard from Bill Owen about. So what's the path as a board that we've been traveling to talk about this issue? The first question that really staff came to us with was, what should the new district's total operating budget amount be? And we've had disagreement about that. That's what Lori's really going to dive into here in the next part of this. What mechanisms is the second question should be used to generate those revenues? And the mechanism that's primarily in the legislative language is has to do with utility fees. Now we've run into some issues there with cost of collection, nexus and proportionality issue, and some city resistance to collecting at least the larger assessment costs on the utility bills. There's reasons for that, and Portland has some good reasons why they've resisted this so far. The third question then is, how should costs be distributed and what are the impacts to customers? We've also started to dive into that question a bit, and we had concerns as a board when we started seeing the impact to customers. And it's not only the allocation of costs between kind of these areas of floodplain protection. We were talking about the watershed that drains in and then district wide. We've had debates about whether there should be a watershed tier or not. And then, as I mentioned, we saw the cost impacts with the initial proposal, and that was concerning, and that led to a revisiting back to number one. And we've been in a bit of a spin cycle around these questions since. Not easy to get anything answered until we pin down the first one. So from my perspective, I think we do have a path to success here, but it needs to be a little more linear. But in the first thing that we really need to do as a board is we need to come to some level of agreement on what that year one total operating budget amount should be. Not an easy task, no, because everybody has a different opinion here, but until we pin this down, it's really hard to move on to the second question, which is we need agreement on the mechanisms to generate those revenues. Once we know those mechanisms and have some level of agreement, we need to agree on how those are distributed to different customer classes. This is more of the nuance. This is more of the detail, but we as a board need to figure this out. That's part of our charge. So just to give you a little preview into what Lori's going to show you next, and what I think could be a successful path. On the very first one, agree on what the year one total operating budget amount should be. You're going to see a proposal of $16.7 million. And that's dramatically less than what you saw last time. What you saw last time was on the higher end of the 20s, pushing to closer to 30 million. So staff has done a lot of work to listen to what the board was saying, to shave costs down to a point where you may or may not agree, but they're going to present today the details behind this figure. Not asking for a vote today, asking for you to consider the information. And then again, that will lead to hopefully at some point a refinement and a vote to pin this number down so we can actually move on. The next, I'm not going to get into these details too much, but what are the mechanisms? The latest that we'll talk about are rely on assessment, continued reliance on some assessments potentially, and then a privilege tax as well. These things do point back to the cities being part of the collection solution, and likely through their utility bill, could be stormwater, could be something else. And then agreement on the exact distribution of cost to customers. We'll get into this, and this is up for debate, obviously, but how much of the increased cost should be borne by those within the managed floodplain versus district-wide? And I think all of us believe that we want to pay our fair share. We think the allocation between the cities should have some rational, defendable nexus for that. There are a few items here, regardless of which direction we go, that do require legislative changes to be made. So that's something that we'll be talking about with regard to process. So what are those next steps? After we as a board can get through those 3 items, I'm confident we can, we need to go back to city councils and have discussion with them and get some level of head nod buy-in from city councils. I think the same goes for legacy districts. But then when we have a strategy that we as a board can move forward, we need to initiate the legislative process to change some of our authorities. So with that, I'm going to point back to focusing us on number 1 for now, and I'm going to turn it over to Lori. But the question I have for all of you guys, as you review Lori's presentation and I've reviewed it, I think it's really solid information you're going to see here. Please give her your full attention. We are diving into a layer of detail here that is difficult for a lot of us to stay with, but please give it her your full attention. And my question to you is, what additional information do you need so that you can form in your head what the proper number is, and we can have a robust board dialogue about that and get this pinned down? Because if we don't pin this down, we're going to stay in the spin cycle, and we don't want to do that. We want to get out of the spin cycle and move forward. So Lori, go ahead.
Thank you, Steve. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. All right, so today we'll be reviewing our updated forecast, which we hope provide you with a responsive forecast and information that will support you in making those decisions on revenue that Steve was discussing earlier. This is our agenda for the discussion today. I apologize, it's long. I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as possible because I know you all prefer shorter presentations. There is a lot of information here, and I hope that what I'm presenting is going to provide some detail that wasn't included in the packet. We'll start with an overview of the updated staff recommendations and review estimated impacts on actual properties within the district. Then we'll move into a review of the forecast, including a review of the foundation of the dollars, a comparison to the 23-24 proposed budgets, and walk through the expense details for personnel and materials and services. We'll round out our discussion with the review of the revenue proposal, and we have time at the end of the presentation for you to begin your discussion. Let's start with an overview of the key takeaways from the forecast document included in your packet today. First, staff have revised the expenditure forecast, reducing it by over $10 million to $16.6 million. We'll review the details behind this forecast later in the presentation. Next, staff have considered feedback from board members and evaluated the best approach to revenue, given collectability, cost of collection, and available paths towards a revenue system for the urban district. Staff recommendation includes revenue from 2 areas in the district, as Steve discussed earlier, one from the properties on the floodplain and one from all district residences and businesses. This is proposed with a combination of assessments in the floodplain and a privilege tax for all district residents and businesses. Let's take a look at the estimated impact of these proposals, keeping in mind that I'm going to say estimate about 400 times. We are doing some more analysis with Eco Northwest on the privilege tax and how that might be allocated. So the allocations that I walked through today are really to give you a sense of the distribution, but not on a proposed methodology. And the assessments and the assessment impact is an estimate as well. And we do want to do some more analysis for you in that area and give you some more real life examples of what's happening there. All right, so this slide gives us estimated calculations of the impact for 2 actual properties in the floodplain. I've got detail on every single property in the floodplain, actually every single property in the district. So if there's a particular property that you're interested in, as we do more analysis, I'm happy to provide you with that information. I would just need what they call the property number to be able to look it up and make sure that I'm giving the information that you're looking for. So this property here is a single family residential property. And the assessment imposed on the property this year was $229. And under the urban district for 24-25, which is 2 years ahead, using a 20% rate increase, which obviously we haven't decided on, but just so that you could see the impact, their assessment is estimated to be $297. And the total tax bill on this property this year was $4,257. And under the proposed revenue is estimated to be $4,325. So the change in total general government tax, I'm not showing the total, so I'm not showing the education side here, is $68 or a little less than 2% of an increase with that 20% rate increase on assessments. So this kind of surprised me, and I'll just stop for a second here. Our assessments actually end up being a pretty small proportion of the total tax bill, and we're only looking at the general bill on this side. There's also a piece where these properties pay for schools. So it sounds pretty alarming to do a 20% rate increase, but then when you start to dig into it, that is an overall percentage of the total tax bill. Isn't quite as scary. I know it's still a lot of money to folks, but it does kind of look different when you look at the total tax bill. So if you add in the allocation of the privilege tax of $19, and I'll talk about how we came up with that a little later in the presentation, and then year 1 of the general obligation bond of $39, and that is at $175 million worth of GO bonds, which I know also hasn't been decided, but I wanted to give you a sense of the impact. The increase that's assignable to the urban district is $126 or less than 3% of their total general property tax bill. This property is a warehouse performing a wholesale distribution. The assessment imposed on this property this year was $14,577, and under the urban district in 24-25, so 2 years out, using that 20% rate increase is estimated at $19,914. The total general government tax bill for this property this year was $358,715, and under the proposed revenue is estimated to be $364,052. So the change in total general government tax is $5,300 or less than 2%. There's that privilege tax, and I know there's been some discussion about allocation of privilege tax. So this is just on a property count, which we know is not what we're going to use. There's that GO bond amount for the $175 million worth of bonds. And that makes the increase to this property $8,682 or less than 3% of their general property tax bill. This slide gives us sample impacts for 2 properties that are outside of the floodplain. I do want to note that based on discussion with council, the privilege tax will not be allocated to a property. I am doing the allocation based on property counts just so that we could get a sense of perspective, but it could be allocated to a resident or via some other mechanism that ties to their utility billing. We have Eco Northwest doing some work for us on that so that we can come back to you with some ideas about what might work best. Both properties in this example are single family residential. In our examples, they would have a similar charge for privilege tax, so there's that $19. The GO bond funding amount is estimated for funding of a $175 million bond at 14 cents per thousand. For our first household, the total cost is $53. And our second household, the total cost is $83. Now, let's look at how the numbers build that expenditure forecast. As we review the forecast, please keep in mind that costs that are included in the forecast and those that aren't. This is a forecast of costs funded by operating revenues, and as such, we've included estimates for costs to operate the district. Some dollars set aside for contingency or emergency spending, payment of principal and interest on full faith and credit borrowings, and dollars for asset preservation. I'll walk you through these costs in more detail in the upcoming slides. There are certain spending items that are not included in this operating forecast. There's no projection included for major capital projects and spending funded by other sources of revenue, such as grants or the future general obligation bonds. There's also no projection of debt service costs for future general obligation bonds, as these costs will be funded via property tax from the property holders in the district. But you did see in my examples that I did have estimates for what that property tax would be for those residents. This is a summary of the updated 5-year operating forecast for the urban district. For our discussion today, we're going to focus on the first year of operations in 24-25. Personnel includes all employee costs for the new district, including wages, benefits, and employer taxes. We'll look closer at the staffing on an upcoming slide. Materials and services includes all other operating costs for the districts, from supplies to professional services to non-capital maintenance costs. New responsibilities is a pool of funds set aside to cover new mandates for the district, including equity, cultural history, and the operating costs for environmental. These new mandates are also being considered in the general obligation bonds, so there'll be additional funding on those capital costs that aren't reflected here. And we've just made this a pool really because we need some direction from the board as to how they would like to focus this spending and whether this is really the amount that they want us to consider for these new responsibilities. Our asset preservation funds are to cover non-bond capital costs. This could be anything from vehicles to replacement of a pump. So there are things that you wouldn't put on the GEO bond, but they are also things that we need to continue to replace and maintain as a district to be able to continue our operations. Contingency is set at 3% of total costs, which was what was recommended by our technical advisory group. I'll just stop for a minute and go off notes. We just went through an emergency management process this morning, a tabletop, and we were talking about, costs that would happen if there were a flood event and how would we pay, example, for additional staffing. This is a really good example of the area that would cover those sorts of costs that are going to add up really quickly. In the budget, under Oregon budget law, the contingency would not be available for us to spend without board authorization. But having these funds set aside would allow us to come to the board and ask for a transfer so that we would be able to cover those sorts of costs if there were an emergency. Debt service is the combined principal and interest payments due for all districts' current outstanding debt. This doesn't include the general obligation bonds. I'll point out that the costs do increase in 2026-27. You can see it goes from $832,000 to $2.3 million. This is the point in time when the payments are scheduled to begin to pay back the city of Portland for the operating credit line that they've provided for the urban district.
Laura, you have a couple questions. I don't know if you want to take them now or after or later.
Steve, how did you want me to handle that?
So Steve is on his way to his car. And so I know Steve wanted to do the parking lot thing. Lori,
Just a technical question. This is not a deep one.
Sure.
I just want to check about inflation index. Am I right in saying new responsibilities in asset preservation are not indexed to inflation?
No, they are not.
Are those the only things that are not indexed to inflation?
Those are the only things that are not indexed for inflation.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So here you can see our inflation assumptions. These have not changed from the initial forecast.
can we check in with Eric?
Oh, I'm sorry. I've got my eyes on the slide, Eric. I didn't mean to ignore you.
You're on mute, sorry.
Lori, where do we have existing debt from the other districts? Penn 2 will have paid off all of its existing debt by the end of 23-24, so I did not expect that to show up. But we've got $8.8 million BB&T loan on MCDD's books.
Yeah,
Where
that's on
is
the
that
debt service
expense?
line. So that debt service line, the $832,000 in year one, all of the existing debt that still has payments scheduled is included on that line.
And that includes Penn 1 as well?
Yes, it does. Includes all
Okay,
districts
thank
that continue to have debt service payments. But including the $1.2 million in borrowing. All right. This slide shows the combination of the proposed budgets for 23-24. These budgets are the basis for the forecast projections for the urban district. Here you can see the total expenditures for all of our districts, which add up to just under $22 million. This column eliminates the inter-district activity. This includes the fixed fees charged to Penn 1, Penn 2, and SDIC for system maintenance performed by MCDD employees, inter-district contracts for administrative support, and funding for the JCA and urban districts, and funds for capital project work performed by MCDD staff. So what we're doing here is eliminating the duplicate counting of those dollars as we have transactions back and forth between the districts. So our combined total spending for all districts net of that inter-district activity is $19.1 million. This slide shows the comparison of that combined 23-24 budget to the forecast for the urban district in year one. So this is our combined budget that we looked at on the previous slide. So there's that 19.1 million. This is our year one forecast for the urban district, the 16.6 million. Personnel costs for existing staff are increasing by 3%. And we'll walk through that in detail on a future slide. Materials and services costs are increasing by 4%. That's the inflation. Debt service actually goes down in year one because of one of our districts completing payment on their debt in 23-24. Thank you, Eric, for pointing that out. Capital costs are declining by 76%. This results from the transition of PMLS related local match funding to the GEO bond, funding of major projects from the assets and liability study by the GEO bond, and the exclusion of grant funded projects from our forecast. So you can see, even though at the bottom, the total expense is going down, it really is because of these items that are in the major capital line. Contingency is a new budget item, which is set at 3% of total cost. Service gaps includes 2 new positions, an IT manager and a new operations specialist. Funding for flood safe office space and temporary storage for equipment and vehicles, and additional maintenance of the system. Startup costs include some temporary staffing to complete dissolution of legacy districts, support for records management, and funding for the watershed improvement plan. And then this is that new responsibilities pool that we discussed previously. This slide summarizes the personnel costs included in the forecast. This schedule shows the reconciliation between the 23-24 proposed personnel budget and the forecast. We've included 2 new positions from the service gaps here, inflation for cost of living increases and benefit cost increases, including increases to the PERS rate, and some funding support from GEO bond administration funds for current staff who'll be working on bond related activities. There are 2 new positions that we discussed previously. This chart shows the allocation of personnel costs with our system operations departments in green and our support services in blue. And this chart shows the allocation by FTE, again with the operations departments in green and support services in blue. There are 2 new positions included in this proposal. This slide gives us a comparison of materials and services costs between the 23-24 budget and the year one forecast. Existing costs are increased by inflation of 4%. Transition costs include temporary staffing and support services to complete legacy district dissolution activities and the related records management and storage. In planning, the transition costs include the watershed improvement plan. This schedule shows us the reconciliation between the forecast and the 23-24 budget. And this is a breakdown of year one materials and services, with the green section showing operations departments totaling 56% of the forecast, materials and services, and support services at 44%. As we discussed earlier, debt service includes the cost of debt service on outstanding debt at the districts. In this example, the debt service schedule assumes that all draws will be taken on the urban district's line of credit with the city of Portland, showing payments beginning in 26-27. If the transition to the urban district occurs in July of 2024, the debt service schedule can be reduced, as you can see by the lower payment amounts for the line of credit starting in 26-27. A total savings of $2.8 million in principal and interest payments is possible if we meet that timing. So let's take a look at the details in the revenue proposal. As we discussed earlier, the revenue proposal includes both assessments on the floodplain and a privilege tax account allocated across the district. This chart shows an estimate of the allocation of the revenues across jurisdictions within the district. The cities of Portland, Fairview, Gresham, and Troutdale add up to 99% of the total revenues, with Portland holding 82%. This chart shows the allocation of revenues by type and jurisdiction. Assessments are limited to the floodplain, and 80% of the assessments fall within the city of Portland. Other revenue includes interest on the dollars in the local government investment pool, development fee revenues, and other miscellaneous receipts. I didn't allocate that by jurisdiction because I didn't have details on development review fees. It would be pretty small, though it's a couple $1,000s in each of the legacy districts. Our modeling currently divides the privilege tax by property counts, which will not be the allocation methodology we can utilize. That would make it a property tax. It does, however, give you a sense of where the residents are within the district and a sense of the allocation that would happen across the jurisdictions. We're doing more analysis right now to determine the best approach for this revenue source. So we'll be able to come back to you and show you more of a utility allocation model. But I did want you to get this information as quickly as possible, which is why we went with this allocation methodology for this starting example. So here you can see the forecast revenues are equal to the forecast expenses for year one, that's 16.6 million. So the forecast currently includes a 20% rate increase in assessments for year one in the urban district. And we'll look at the estimated impact of that increase on individual taxpayers. Again, in a future slide, we saw that at the beginning too. We're doing more analysis in this area so that you can get a better sense property by property, what's happening. But for now, this at least gives you an initial view. So this shows you the assessments by jurisdiction, with the properties in the city of Portland and Troutdale providing 91% of the assessment revenues. For local government partners, assessments less compression under the county's current methodology is equal to $4.5 million. Our forecast provides for resolution of the impact of compression on local government properties, either through legal remedies in process or through a contribution by our local partners. So we're still working with outside counsel and with Multnomah County to try to work through the methodology that they're using for assessments on government properties, and don't have an outcome yet. If we get an outcome that it aligns with what we believe is correct, then we won't have to go back to those government properties to ask for them to support us in making up for the recovery of the compression on the government properties. We do believe that it's not being administered correctly. Either way, we're proposing that we do ask for our government partners to make up for the compression.
We have a hand raised, Eric.
Yeah, so let me be clear on this. So one of the ways to look at this is we raised $5.1 million from landowners, residences, and businesses.
Mhm.
We raise currently $4.5 million, of which 3.6 is from Port of Portland, and the rest is from other government properties.
Yes.
Right, and so, for example, would this include Heron Lakes as a government entity that pays tax to us?
No.
Okay, how about Metro Expo?
Metro, yes.
Right, so that's a $202,000 per annum, correct?
I don't know.
It's in a future slide. We'll double check it as we go through to that, okay?
Sounds good.
Okay. But this is a useful breakdown because it gets back to one of the key recommendations, which is that we alter ORS 550 to include the ability to do an intergovernmental tax.
Correct.
Correct. Okay, excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome. Tanny?
Hi, Lori.
Hi, Tanny.
So if we've got one that throws, a property goes into compression, right? We're asking that the municipalities make that up? The impact to the district?
That is part of the analysis that we're still doing, Tanny, because I know there's some concerns, especially in East County, as to that impact. There are a couple of things that are in this model that we need to kind of dig into the details and make sure that we're covering. Number one, for all of the floodplain, we're using the MCDD allocation methodology. And I know that there's been some concerns, particularly from our East County partners, in what impact that's going to have, because each individual district has been setting their rates for all of these years. So what happens when we have a combined rate that then gets allocated using the MCDD methodology? Right now, I can say I don't know for certain what that impact is. And add on top of that, for SDIC properties, we have to factor in compression. Right now, it's about between 10 and 15% compression that happens to those SDIC properties. So that actually, we need to do some work on that so that we can see what the impact is on the other partners when that compression starts hitting the district.
Okay, exactly. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Corky?
So I might be confused. Just clarify for me here, please. The recovery of impact of compression line, the 1.2 million,
Yes.
is that compression of government-owned properties, such as the Port of Portland fell into a compression problem, or is that compression of private properties that we want to?
This is government owned. The
Okay.
county is calling this compression. When you look at their calculation, I argue that it is not compression.
Yeah.
So that's the piece that we're researching. And I'm saying, regardless of whether we end up with a positive legal outcome that agrees with me that this is not really compression, it's just the way they're doing the math. Or if we ask our government partners to reimburse us for the impact of compression on government-owned properties, my proposal is that the government-owned properties pay 100% of their allocation of the assessments.
And just to be really clear, so this does not address compression of private properties.
No, it does not.
Thanks.
Nancy, did I see your hand?
Yeah, it was just that follow-up question that Corky just asked.
Okay, yeah, I don't have a proposal for addressing compression on private residential properties and business properties. I
Lauren,
can't fix the Oregon tax system. I wish I could, but I can't.
You would be a very popular person if you came up with that. So.
Yeah, I would, be able to retire happily. But any other questions?
I would like to point out that the privilege tax doesn't create compression, nor does the general obligation bond. So at least on the broader district, we're not adding to the burden. Just to clarify that for everyone.
All right, so as we continue to develop scenarios related to the privilege tax, we're providing an allocation of the proposed tax by property count. We know that a by property billing is not allowed, as this creates a property tax. And we're currently working on various scenarios that will likely be utility based, that will likely create some dichotomy between what's charged to a business versus what's charged to a residence. Property counts do provide us with a sense of distribution of the tax across the district. And as you can see, almost 95% of the tax will come from the cities of Portland and Gresham in this example. Dividing the revenue amount of $5.6 million by the number of district properties results in an annual charge of less than $19 per property or $1.58 per month. But like I said, that just gives you a sense of perspective as to allocation. Obviously, the methodology that Eco Northwest helps us to develop to present to you all will look different, but should have a similar sense of allocation. This slide shows a comparison of revenues in 23-24 to our potential revenue allocation scenario included on the previous slides. So this column shows our assessments for 23-24 with details for each local government partner, which is those government-owned properties. And these are estimates and include the impact of compression as it's currently administered by Multnomah County. So you can see our total assessments are 8.4 million. This column shows other local partner support and other sources of revenue in the 23-24 budget. So that includes stormwater fees, it includes contributions from local partners, and then other sources down below is things like grants. So this, if you add these two columns together, that gives us our total budgeted revenue of $14.4 million. This column shows the allocation of assessment revenues net of compression. So that's $9.7 million. This column shows the recovery of the impact of local government partner compression on assessments of properties owned by those governments. So that's $1.2 million. Here you see the $5.6 million for the proposed privilege tax. And finally, you can see an estimate by local partner of the difference between this version of revenue and the 23-24 levels of support currently received. So you're seeing reductions for most partners with the exception of Metro, which most of their contribution is assessments, and the Port of Portland, which really shows you that impact. About $400,000 or $500,000 of that is impact of compression currently that we don't believe is being administered correctly. So hopefully we'll have a positive outcome on that. And I'll get your question in just a second, Eric. Then you can see the increases in assessments for other landowners related to that 20% rate increase. And we are going to do some more analysis for you on that so that you can see more information by property. Net of compression and collectability, that 20% rate increase results in a 13% increase in revenue collected from non-government landowners in the floodplain. And you can see the reduction in other revenues due to the exclusion of grant revenues and grant funded costs from the projections. Eric?
And so Lori, one of the major changes is that 3.4 million. Are we assuming that we're not going to get any of those grants for next year?
No, we're not. But for you all to make a decision about operating revenue, we don't need to include the grant funded activity in there. We do anticipate that we'll continue to seek grant funding for particularly for capital related costs, which is where we've seen that funding in the past. But including those amounts would just be a plus and a minus. So it really doesn't add any additional information for you to see the in and out. So we've left it out of the analysis so that you can see what needs to be funded by operating costs alone. Part of those grants, part of that grant funding in 23-24 is for the PMLS local match. And we do have time limits on that. So we do anticipate that the local match funding will come from the GEO bond when we're moving forward with the urban district.
So the best way for me to think about these numbers is that we had 14.4 million less the 3.5. So we're
Little under 11
okay.
million.
Right.
So if you add the 11 plus
Right.
the 5 for privilege tax, you're back to.
Right. So the real increase is probably more on the order of magnitude of about $5 million
Yeah, which
to
is the
support
privilege tax.
operating expense.
That's correct.
So 5 million operating. Okay.
Yeah, if you look, the local partner assessments, including the recovery of the compression, is a reduction of 601,000, and then the landowner assessments is an increase of 674. So if you net that, it's only I don't want to say only, I apologize, Mary Helen. It is a $73,000 increase in total for assessments.
Got it. Thank you.
And other local partner contributions. Seth?
Yeah, is the so in the previous forecast, was the grant funding that's primarily capital also included as part of the operating revenue?
No, I've left the grants out in all of the forecasts.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. So our financial advisors have given us an estimate of 14 cents per thousand of assessed value as the cost associated with the issuance of $175 million in GEO bonds. This chart shows you the allocation by jurisdiction given that annual cost estimate. So there's 84% in the city of Portland and 10 in the city of Gresham. So 94% of the GEO bond funding will come from those two cities. Seth, did you have another question? Or is your hand just up? Thank you. This chart shows a series of properties currently in the district floodplain. And this is the analysis that we have been working on with SDAO as far as estimated insurance premiums if we were to lose our accreditation. So here you can see the total district charges under the new proposal. And here you can see the information that SDAO has been able to provide us on what the insurance, the flood insurance premium would be on these properties if they lost accreditation. So you can see that the costs, unless the landowners choose to be self-insured, which if you are in a private residence and you have a mortgage, you're not going to be able to choose to be self-insured, but businesses could. If they do not choose to be self-insured, then the costs for the landowners in the floodplain could potentially be significantly higher in this situation. And that's really the only purpose of this, is to get a sense. It's pretty extreme when you start to see what those estimates for insurance costs are. But that's the sole purpose of this slide.
And Lori, so it's the Special Districts Association of Oregon, and they use their insurance broker, Brown and Brown, if I'm not mistaken, to look at these actual properties, right, and develop a specific assessment. So I just wanted to share that with the board to know that it was a fairly legit analysis, is I guess what I'm trying to demonstrate.
Yeah, as I understand, it's a little bit challenging to do this. And there'll be some like weird zoning things that happen, which Colin can probably better describe than me, because I know numbers, not technicalities around floodplain and zoning and all of that. But when they looked at that and looked at what would happen to the property's zoning and what would happen if there wasn't that accredited levy, these were the these were the types of changes that you would see for those properties in the floodplain for insurance costs. So this slide is just a reminder of the polling information that's been shared with the board in previous presentations. We found that residents outside the floodplain were willing to pay up to $84 a year to build and operate flood control projects. Keeping this in mind, let's take a final look at those estimated impacts. So this slide gives us the sample impacts for those two properties that are outside of the floodplain. We talked about these earlier, so I'm gonna go through this really quickly. So the first property was a total of $53, and the second one, which has an assessed value of $432,000, was $83. Jim, can you remind me what the average assessed value is for our new district? Do you remember?
I don't have that number at my fingertips. Colin, do you recall?
I thought it was under 300.
It is. I can pull it up. It's somewhere around
Sorry.
$250,000 for assessed value, taxable value, not real market value.
So
the
the
median.
property, yeah, so the property on the left is a little under the median, and the property on the right is a lot higher than the median, so that you can see that impact. And let's go to the summary. Here's our key points. Our forecast expense in year one is $16.6 million. We're proposing a transfer of assessment authority from the legacy districts to the urban district for properties in the floodplain. And we're proposing that the gap in revenues of $5.4 million be filled with a privilege tax allocated across the district. And we're still working on that allocation methodology. And with that, I'll stop sharing. I can take questions, or I can just mute myself and let you all discuss at this point, because I know you would like to have time to talk through things. Dave?
Yeah, the thing that isn't covered here is in your presentation was the effective compression throughout the district, because proper compression is, as I understand it, is property by property on what's levied, and the district has different levels of compression all over the district, which is why the legislature passed ORS 550 as a service district to be paid for by a service fee. And while you I do not understand what the publicly owned property compression argument you're having with the county assessor's office. I don't understand that, and maybe everybody else does. Maybe I need a private tutorial on it, but I didn't follow that. But that's the only place compression was addressed. And
Correct.
The fundamental problem is properties that are compressed more will pay less of the share of the district, and properties that are compressed less will end up paying more of the district, and it isn't fair. And that's why the legislature passed ORS 550 the way they did. And I understand from the recent meetings that the staff doesn't want to handle it the way the legislature passed it, but I am still unconvinced that it can't be done that way as a service fee district with a GO bond. The objections that were mentioned, and from the Portland, I don't know, Water Bureau or whoever would collect a service fee, that the fee would be bigger than they're used to assessing. Some properties would have to pay to a lot more than they used to. And the business about it not being a deductible item all seem hand waving, make that they're not good arguments. And if I'm the only one not convinced, I'd be surprised. but I am just not convinced. And you're just running down the track on this path toward imposing ad valorem taxes to pay operations. I'm very disappointed. I don't know. I think maybe I need to have private discussion especially with you, Lori. I really, you might be able to convince me, but haven't so far. I'll leave it at that.
I don't want to not answer your question, Dave, but I think it was more of a comment than a question.
And I think we'll bring more. And so duly noted.
Yeah, I'm not
Councilor,
expecting you to answer it right now. I'm just settle for duly noted.
I do see.
I do want to acknowledge, and I understand your frustration, and we are doing some more analysis so that our board members can get a sense of perspective on this and what the impact is on residential compression. But as I said earlier, I am not in a position where with this district I can fix the compression issues with the Oregon property tax system.
So I see our chair has his hand up, and I just want to see if he wants to jump in here. Steve, you're on your phone.
Thanks. I fear we're making the same mistake we've made time and time again, in that we're trying to accomplish way too much with one meeting. I really was hoping that my part of the presentation was going to focus on number one. We're trying to answer number 1, 2, and 3 simultaneously, and it's impossible to do. We need to focus, and I think we need to commit that we're going to come back and talk about steps 2 and 3 later. But unless we can focus on step 1, which is to try to get from you guys, the board, what additional information, if any, what questions you have around the $16.7 million that it's going to cost the new district to operate in year 1, we are going to get nowhere. So please focus on number 1. And that's all I have to say.
James, do you want to do the facilitation based on who's got their hands up? Do you want staff support for that? Since I'm guessing Steve is driving and can't tell whose hands are up.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I guess what I'm inclined to, I'll call on folks here. What I'm inclined to say is, Councilor Rittman, I appreciate your comments. It sounds like it's a good place for the parking lot, and just to make sure that we've heard your concern. And that is, you don't have a problem with the privilege. I shouldn't say that. You don't have a problem with the a fee charged to the larger district. You do have a problem with retaining the uneven compression and perhaps inequity for properties in the managed floodplain. Is that correct? I don't see you, Councilor Rittma.
Well, yes, you stated well. The privilege tax doesn't, the compression isn't an issue, and the geo bond compression isn't an issue. The legislature set this up as a service fee district because, I contend anyway, because of Oregon's property tax system having this peculiarity of compression. And that would make it inequitable for us in East County. Our properties would end up paying more share of the operating costs. Period. We would. And I don't know of a fix.
So let's add that to the parking lot. And again, Steve, I appreciate you trying to direct us toward the components that make up the bottom line budget of about $16 million. Let's try, if we can, to direct our comments and questions to that content.
Yeah. Do you want it? You can have it. You can have it.
Okay, Mary Helen.
Okay, I have a little bit of problem with definitions, so but I don't know how to get answers for high policy decisions of this without details. So where's the quote unquote parking lot so we can look at it if we get that information? And I want to know if any of the figures considered financial hardship. Thank you for recognizing the fact of is only, because I say that a lot. But $139 on a $200,000 property in my neighborhood, which is probably a rental, I'd have to look them up. I don't think. And where did you get the 229,000? Was it all of the district combined, or because we have the mobile home park and Delta Wood?
That's just that specific property, Mary Helen. So if you go out to the Multnomah County property tax website and type in that property number, you can see their tax bills and you can see that that was the assessed value for that property.
So, okay, so I won't do any more guessing there, and I need to know where that was. And
Sure.
was financial hardship considered in any of the rates? Because all utilities, water, sewer, etc., have a contingency that if you have X amount of income and I don't have it, and I couldn't look it up and flip back and forth and not get out of the meeting, but that there be a contingency for that in this process. I didn't see it mentioned anywhere, so.
No, we're doing more analysis on the side of the privilege tax, Mary Helen, and what I'm thinking, but this is just initial thought, because it's really critical to me as well to consider that financial hardship. What I'm thinking is that we're really going to want to work with each jurisdiction and use the same rules that they are already in place in the system. So if someone is getting a financial hardship credit, the same thing would happen with our fee as is happening with the rest of their utility bill. I don't know what the impact of that is. That's part of the work that we need to do with Eco Northwest to understand how much of an increase to the $5.4 million would happen to be able to allow for that fund that would consider financial hardship. But I agree with you. I think that is a really critical issue from an equity perspective. And I do believe that we as a district do owe that to our taxpayers. And so definitely that's going to be part of the analysis. Like I said, we wanted to get this new concept to you as soon as possible, which meant that part of the analysis just hasn't been complete. And we will definitely be coming back with more information.
Okay, then one last question is, and Steve's red box is about agree on the exact distribution of cost to customers. How best do we do that if we don't know some of these other things? For instance, with the new responsibilities, it's like, to me, a bucket of money to spend on things. And so are we able to pick and choose what kind of things those are? Because you just mentioned equity, and in the ORS 550, it says promote equity in all we do. If we did something like that, we're promoting equity. And I've asked this before, it sounds like an equity position is something other staff do currently, but this would be to pay for their time doing equity things. I'm just going to say that about, it's the same, it's true for me with cultural history.
The $500,000 is put in this projection or this forecast as a pool because we need that further guidance from the board as to how we should be allocating that spending. So I think the question that's on the table for you all today is, do you think the $500,000 is the right amount? Could be less, could be more. We don't know. We need that guidance. When we get into the budget process for the year one budget for the district, that's when the board really puts their hand into the allocation of this cost and lets us know how you want to budget these dollars. So this is a forecast. It's, obviously going to be somewhere close when we do the budgeting, but that's really where you're going to have the impact, is to take a look at that budget process. But we left that a pool because we really felt like that was an area where the board members needed to kind of talk through things and make some decisions about, one, whether it was the right amount, and two, how you really would like to see that allocated, and start to think before we get into the budget process about how you would want to do that allocation. So I'm not going to tell you how that money should be spent. You really need to give us that sort of policy guidance. As far as equity positions, we haven't added any FTEs for equity. On my HR team, they do work in equity today, both in hiring and in training. I am really working with my procurement staff to start to implement equity as part of our procurement process. It doesn't cost you any extra because I've got the same FTEs in there. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you, Mary Helen, for those questions. So we've got about, looks like about 7 questions, 7 folks with their hands up. We've got about 22 more minutes on this topic. So let's try to be succinct in our questions. As we evaluate this year 1 budget, Lori, which slide would you like to, do you think we ought to people ought to be referring to most? Is it slide 7, 7 and 8? Is there one that you think we
let me
ought
go
to
back. Hold on.
Just a point of information for the board, expecting that this was a topic that would require and warrants a deep conversation among the board. We're prepared to use the entire time for this topic, and that's our plan. So you guys have a little bit more time, and if we need more discussion, we'll schedule it. So this isn't the end, it's the beginning. So thank
Great.
you, everyone.
Thank you for that, Jim. While Lori's looking at slides.
So slide 7, which if you want me to pull it up, I can. Do you want me to go ahead and pull that up, James?
Yes, please.
Sure.
Corky?
Thanks. I think I have some distinct quick questions, but first I will just reiterate, as I have before, Dave, I completely agree with you on the compression thing. We were there. We know that we wanted to avoid that as much as possible. So if there is an offline conversation on that, include me. I'd love to be there as well. And Lori, thank you for the data. I'm seeing the data that we got not as a commitment to continue with the property tax, but more as a, let's take a look at what this means. And that's fantastic data that you've given us, Lori. I really appreciate it. The questions I've got, well, first one is the debt service in a few years ends up being about 1.7 million a year. When does that end? Do we have any idea? Roughly?
Yeah, we do have a full debt service schedule that I think I sent out to you all, but I've sent you a lot of pages, I know. So
I'm thinking it's 10 years.
I don't want to quote it because I would have to go out and look again to make sure I'm giving you the right answer. But Wendy, if you can write me a note, I'll make sure and get the board members that debt service schedule again so that you can see the payment schedules for the outstanding debt.
Maybe the more important part of that question is, do we anticipate continued debt service after what we have right now ends at one point in time? And then I presume we have a little budget boost at that point. Is that correct? Or do we anticipate adding more debt service?
I think that would be a question for the future board when we start to recognize other needs for capital acquisition. So that's really hard. If I had a crystal ball, I wouldn't be working here, right? That's so I would say there's a possibility that there would be future debt issuance for capital related spending, but that would be up to the board to make those decisions.
All right, thanks. Now, my next questions are all about inflation, because my concern is if we don't adjust for inflation, next year, no big deal. The year after that, who cares? But in 10 years, 20 years, we got a real problem. So it's kind of a question and suggestion on the privilege tax. Was that one adjusted for inflation?
Well, we're only showing you year 1 for the privilege tax. And when we've met with our local partners and kind of walked through some projection information, what we were leaning towards was to look at a potential 3% increase each year to the privilege tax. But we've also talked about tying it to utility rates. So I think there's a lot of different ways where we could go. I kind of like the 3% just because that seemed, not to be incredibly unfair, but yeah.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I do want to speed it along for others' sake. That answers my question. Thank you. The other 2 items, the new responsibilities and the asset preservation, which are not inflation indexed, I guess it's sort of a question, is there a real reason why not, or is there a reason why we don't do that? It seems that it would be important to index those for inflation.
The asset preservation, that's an interesting question. So in the asset and liability study, what we did was we took a look at 10 years worth of spending, which was inflation projected, and then we just did an average across all of the years. And what you'll see when you budget is some years are going to be lower and some years are going to be higher. And I will be coming forth to the new board with some discussion about capital reserves. So if we didn't spend the $1.5 million, for example, I would say, you know, let's pull together a reserve policy so that we can hold on to that money, so that in years when it goes up, we would have the dollars to be able to cover the things that we needed to purchase in those higher years. But that is more of a long-term planning discussion for us as we get up and running with the district. So I guess the short answer to your question is, yeah, the inflation is built into that asset liability study. We're just kind of evenly allocated because it depends on the year, like how
That
much
works
that
short
cost is
term.
going to
Long
be.
term is what my concern was. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the new responsibilities, I guess that's part, my suggestion is sort of an answer to your question. What should that amount be? I don't know either, but I'm more worried about it, indexing that for inflation also, so that it doesn't end up 10 years down the road just being a smaller and smaller amount.
You know, I kind of anticipate, although this is really up to some board discussion, that a portion of this could be like a grant program to fund either environmental or cultural history. And in that case, like, you don't necessarily need to inflation index it, because it would be awards that we're giving to other not-for-profits, that sort of thing. So I think it just depends on the direction of the board and what they want us to do with those dollars, which is why I didn't inflation impact it, because it you know, it depends on what it ends up being, whether it would need to have that inflationary impact.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you. I think Nancy has a comment on that. For what I'm not sure what the
Nancy's
comment,
laughing at
reaction
me.
there. So thanks a lot, Laurie. I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Corky. Up next, I've got Tanny.
Oh, thanks. Do you want to take Nancy first? Because Nancy, just yours go off of what Corky was talking about.
Sure. I don't mind going first, Tanny, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay, so I was laughing about the whole grant thing. We've had several different grant programs sort of grow organically over the year. We're pulling them together, looking at them wholesale, like what are our goals, blah, blah, blah. And I have to say that grant administration is like a thing. Like, it's a serious chunk of someone's time, because you want to do it equitably and all that. Plus, it does need to go up, because you can't get the same impacts if you don't pay more. I mean, that's just how it is. So I agree with Corky on that. I would, I'm sticking to question one here, around the 500K for whatever you're calling that.
New responsibilities.
New responsibilities, thank you. I would say I wouldn't mind that. I think that might be appropriate for the first year. And beyond inflation, what I am imagining is after that first year or first 18 months, that program is going to get its feet under it, and it's going to know that some larger amount is actually needed. So I'd say within 3 years, that might be up to $1 million, and then you would index it for inflation, kind of thing. I think that I think I've heard this before in this forum. Hey, why would you front load it if it's going to take you a year or so to figure it out? And that's around, I've heard it on many different things in this budget. And I would say in this particular line, 500 for our entire budget of 16.7 or whatever it is, seems low, but not for the first year. So that's my input there. And then something I'm just a little confused about, and I bet, Lori, you're just going to tell me right away, is the 16.7 million amount seems to be less than the 19 point whatever amount we have now. And I'm a little confused why we're going down from 24 to 25, because I know we're getting some efficiencies, but we also have some new responsibilities too, not just the 500K. So can you answer that for me, please?
I can. Mainly because our initial forecast had significant number of new positions, and we've removed those. That's where much of the savings is.
And I think just to put a pin in it, the actual operating costs are higher, and the number looks lower primarily because of a shift in the Oregon business grants for the local match of the PMLS.
If you compare to the 23-24 budget, but if you're if you're looking back to the original forecast.
No, it's the FY 24 to FY 25.
Okay, let me go
Yeah,
to that.
We're going up by $1.5 million, Lori?
I'm gonna go
roughly?
to that slide. Hold on just a second.
Thanks for taking a moment with this. I got,
Yeah.
I thought, well, that's good news, right?
While Lori's doing that, I think that $500,000 for new responsibilities is somewhere just under 3% of the forecasted budget.
Yeah, it seems super low to me. So, but not for the first year.
Okay, so here we go, Nancy. On the left is the combined budgets at 19.1.
Yeah, that one.
And then, so if you look sort of towards the middle and you see the line that says capital, it goes down by $4.8 million. That's the grant funded capital, mainly the PMLS local match dollars that are going to shift to the GEO bond. So we're really not going down, we're going up. It's just that capital is shifting over to the GEO bond.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, great. Next, thank you, Tanny, for deferring, yielding for Nancy. I've got you next, and up after you is Eric Molander.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Allison. And assessments transferred over, would that be year one? And would it be any subsequent years? And how would that work for the legacy districts?
What we're proposing is that there would be a transfer of the assessment authority for the properties in the floodplain that would continue unless the new board made a decision to look at a different revenue methodology, which is always a possibility, I guess.
So the legacy districts would be dissolved at that point?
Correct.
And it would just be the urban district that would be taking over assessing.
Yeah, I mushed everything together and moved it into the urban district for this projection. That's a highly technical word, mushing.
Mushing?
Mushing.
But they would be dissolved before this took place.
It's not that clean and simple, right? Because things are moving, but we would shift all of the costs and all of the revenue over to the urban district. There would be some, close out of the old districts, and there's some, interesting kind of contracting movement and timing of things, but the intent is that we would just wholesale shift everything.
Okay. So it'd be good to have that really nailed down as far as what the expectation of the legacy districts are and what the expectation of the new district would be at that point.
What we would expect is that there wouldn't be expenditures on the legacy district.
But they wouldn't be collecting the revenue. The new district would.
No, the new district would be collecting the revenue. So everything would just kind of shift.
Okay. And then
if it would be July 1st of 24, presuming the legislative action is successful, that the first dollar would arrive to the urban district, and that would be the day that the board could call for dissolution. And then the dissolution process would probably take a year.
Okay. And then the other thing, which I think is probably a policy discussion, would be debt service. The understanding was going to be that everything was going to kind of be shaken out as the districts came in, what the legacy district's responsibility was in the urban district. And it looks like we're bringing a lot of debt with us into that new urban district.
Yeah, a good quantity of that debt, Tanny, is the operating borrowing that we're doing on the urban district right now. So we'll be up to 3.6 million. And then the other kind of big chunk is the capital borrowing that we did on MCDD.
Yeah, I'm thinking like the IFA loans and some of those things.
Yeah, those are, smaller in the big scheme of things, but I am planning to send out the debt service schedule so that you can see everything
Yeah, I
that's
think we've
outstanding.
got like 6 or 8, right? That's carrying.
Yeah.
6, I think. Yeah, so we'll want to look at that and figure out how to take care of that.
Yeah, that'll be debt distribution plans with each of the legacy districts that will be considered by the urban board.
Okay, and then the So we're asking the municipalities to pick up the portion of compression, right, that's on their properties and pay that
Correct.
back.
Yep.
And then again, to kind of dovetail off of Council Ritma's question would be, what if we've got a property that's not in compression that goes into compression and there's an impact to the government section? How is that being handled? Right, so a property. that's
Well,
going
if
into
a
compression that's not in
property is
compression.
not in compression that picks up compression, that's actually less compression that's being incurred by the other local government partners in that area, which is why we need to do some more analysis and provide to the board that information so that you can actually see, you know, what's shifting. Because it's an allocate. So if a property is in compression, basically what the county does is it looks at that property and it looks at all of the local government taxes on that property, and then it does a weighted average allocation. So if all of the compression has been sitting with the taxing authorities like in SDIC, and we haven't incurred any compression on SDIC, and now we're shifting some of that, that actually takes compression away from the other local government partners. But we do need to do some more analysis so that you can actually see that in action, because those compression calculations will cross your eyes if you look at the file that has, I don't know, like
It would
300.
take it away, but it would put more on the local government structure of that property.
No, it actually gives them less because it's a weighted average allocation.
But I mean, it would lower what their amount that they receive is.
No, it would increase the amount they receive because the compression now is being spread across one more government.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then lastly, do we know approximately how many, if any, FTEs are going to be bonded? So from the current group that we have, are we shifting, let's say, 3 of those to the bond package? So what would the labor impact be of that?
Yeah, what I did was I looked at the $175 million, 5% administrative overhead number, and then spread that across 10 years. And we're able to, that gives you about 2 FTEs, one of which we're assuming in the forecast comes from existing staff. And one is a new position, which is a deputy project manager that we think we're going to need to be able to manage all of these projects. It'll be under the GEO bond. So we are making an assumption that there is some related funding in this operating forecast. I'm just showing it as a reduction in staffing costs, but it's not a lot because you have to spread it. You have to spread it over 10 years because that's the amount of time that it's going to take to do the projects. And then you have to factor in the inflation. So it ends up being, you know, a whole 2 FTEs that we can get.
And then
Jim? I think he was starting to say something.
Jim?
Uh-oh, his speaker just went dead.
That's a sign.
our microphones, we had a, nope, they're all blinking red.
Somebody's got a sale on
Yeah,
batteries.
well, while they're sorting that out, it sounds like we have, Tanny, thank you for your questions. It sounds like we have a future either parking lot or action item around making sure each of the making sure that the interim board and particularly the representatives on the interim board who represent their legacy district understand the liabilities that each district is bringing into the new debt service. I think that's important. We'll want to get to that.
And then we have on the parking lot too, James, is the further analysis of the impacts of compression.
Okay, I think I have a microphone. I don't know. I just wanted to make sure we don't, I want to be really transparent with the board that the bond costs that have been presented to you incorporate additional FTE that will be 100% bond funded. And those FTE are built into the cost forecast of the 175 million of the bond. The 2 FTE that Lori's talking about are 1 additional that we know we want to hire and 1 existing amount of an FTE that would be billed to the bond. So again, those 2 FTE are not the only ones that will be bond funded. They are the ones of administrative staff that will be charged to the bond. The others are 100% doing bond related work and would be charged 100% to the bond.
Thanks, Jim.
And we haven't seen those yet, obviously. Okay.
No, that's part of the detail that Bill is pulling together on the GEO bond packages.
Okay, thanks.
Super. Eric Molander, thank you for waiting patiently.
Oh, you're welcome. So number one, I still want to look at the use of a stormwater fee. So put me in that Dave Ritma group, and I've been doing some interviewing on it. And I think that there is a practical solution to that. If you flip over to your slide 19, let me get to it.
Let me get to it. Is that the comparison of properties, or is that the,
It's comparison of properties.
okay. And I'm gonna go up to where I showed it the first time because I didn't present slide 19, because it was a repeat. Okay.
Okay, so we've got to be aware of how our residents are going to end up looking at the number of the amount of the increase. And in truth, what they'll end up doing is saying, I used to pay a stormwater fee of $229. Now I'm paying a stormwater fee that's $126 more. And that's a 55% increase. And the businesses would look at it as, I've got a stormwater fee of $14,577. It's now $8,682 more, and that's a 59.6% increase. So when we look at this, I don't want us to assume that people will have a little bit of inflation illusion. They will track it back to the underlying cause, and they will want to have very solid answers as to what that 55% increase really is going for. So that's one thing. And then the final thing that I have is in terms of what we can afford to pay. And I go back to the slide, Lori, that you first showed to us on March 16th, which is your ending fund balance for June 2024. And thinking about where we're going to be, the concern that I have is that MCDD will have about $1 million in reserve to tide them over from July 1 until the first tax comes in October. And at this point, I don't see a plan in place to keep MCDD from bouncing checks. You know, July 1, they start with $1 million. They'll have about $850,000 of operating expenses. That leaves them with $150K available to pay operating. And then in August, what happens?
I think that's really the question that I've been highlighting for the board, is that.
Right, but we can't afford all of these new positions that you have in the budget.
I don't have any new positions in the
Until we
budget.
know that we've got the money in hand.
There's no new positions in the MCDD budget for 23-24.
They are filled from where they are today.
Correct.
All the unfilled positions are going to be filled. And then looking at that, from my perspective, that's unsustainable.
Yes, I agree.
Okay.
I think that's
So
why we're doing this urban district, right?
Well, no, it's really to get back to, we began in 2021 with a $5 million level of personnel. We're now thinking in 24-25, it's 7.5. Again, it's a massive increase in it. And is that truly affordable? And this is where I would urge us all to say, wait a second, let's dial it back. Maybe what we do is we not spend the money until we have it and maintain ourselves at a level of $12.8 million of operating expenses until we have these other revenue streams in place. because the result is, quite honestly, at some point in August of 2024, you're going to be sitting there with a checkbook for MCDD that's got nada in it.
Can I,
And writing a check against that is just not possible.
can I just ask a point of order? So Eric, I understand what you're saying in terms of, I have a checkbook, I know how to use it. Exactly that. I'm not sure it translates exactly over to what we're talking about here. And my point of confusion at this moment is you're talking about the 24 MCDD budget, which starts in a couple months,
Right.
which is not our budget. So isn't that a question for the MCDD board?
No. See, that's part of the confusion that you're injecting into it. That is the base that we're starting off on in 24-25. And so what I'm saying very clearly is we're spending money that we don't have. And when we look at that budget for 24-25, we need to be aware that we're not going to have the resources to be able to pay for even the level that we're at in this existing budget.
Great. Let me jump in here quickly, and I'm asking the staff if I've got this right. Our charge, so I understand that we're looking at a proposed budget or more of a forecast. And so we can't just weigh in on whether we think the forecast meets our service obligations to this new district. We have to balance it the same. We have to include in that question, that analysis, what revenues might actually be available. In other words, is it feasible? So I think we're here to answer whether it's $12 million, 15, 16, $20 million. We're here to get to step one, which is, does the proposed budget meet our service responsibilities for the mission of the organization? I think that's job number one. So I think, Eric, if you feel like 12 million meets our obligations, that's a valid opinion. I look to staff to tell us that they have access to the revenue and they have the controls in spending to collect the budget and spend it adequately to meet our services. So I kind of feel like I would rather have people weigh in on, does the budget meet the responsibilities that we have for service? So Jim and Lori.
So Jim, James, what do you want out of me?
Great question. We've been presented with many board packets over the months. I looked to slides, what I call slides 3 through 9 in here. Does the representation of what the legacy boards have been spending, including collectively this year, and when adding things like contingency and new mandates, new responsibilities, do we have confidence that we have the right number at just under $17 million? And if the answer is no, or I don't have enough detailed information to understand how that translates into the actual activities, I think we've seen a lot of that information. We don't necessarily have it all in this board packet. What will give you confidence that, or including the confidence to disagree on the total budget amount that we should collect to meet our responsibilities? I don't want to back into it by saying what is it entirely by what we have access to now. We're talking about new revenue sources that will fund the agency, but we have to come first to terms of what are our obligations, and even if we disagree on those obligations, right? We need to build a budget for the services we need to provide. It seems like we've done in my opinion, the staff have kind of crosswalked what the existing agencies are doing, the existing districts are doing, added those new services, provided for contingencies, and that satisfies my needs, but that's just me. But I think what we're trying to do is get to that number first.
Right, and so allow me to look at it. I started with the point of what can we afford given the resources that we have. And that turns out to be about 12.8, but it does leave MCDD in a disastrous position in August of 2024. As you look at that 12.8, then you start to say, what are those additional elements do we have that we could add back in? And we have to add in the debt service, even though that it appears to be interest only on the BB&T loan. We have to have adequate capital just to maintain that. So that's $1.5 million. We would like to have the contingency in that because budgets are not really well understood. And then as we start to look at the service gaps in particular and the new responsibilities for the initial year, I would eliminate those because there's no clear sense that we would end up being able to generate that. Now, I mean, the other question, and Laura, I'd be happy to talk with you about what do we do when MCDD runs out of money. But this is something that is a very real problem. And that gap funding between when the legacy districts continue to operate versus the urban operates can lead us into a position where we don't have any money. That's what Lori's been saying all along, and that's what we need to also have on our list. Now, James, if you would like to put that on the parking lot, be my guest.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Seth, thank you for your patience.
No problem. I'll try and keep it short since I know we're running out of time, and I'm hoping that this conversation will carry over into our next board meeting. I do have a lot of questions about the upcoming proposal. I started putting those questions in an email to Steve, and then I ended up having to put an executive summary on the email because it had gotten too long. And then he and I had a conversation where I tried to rethink how I was looking at this. I don't really want to get into issues of year 2, 3, 4, and 5. I think that is appropriate for MCDD staff to have to figure out how you manage the debt service versus capital allocation versus transition into new programs. My personal sense is I think that the year 1 budget is high on administration, and that hopefully over a 3 or 4 year window, some of that would transition to programs, additional capital assets when the debt service is gone. I think that plowing that back into operations or capital replacement's fine. Again, all of this to say, there's a lot of frustrations around this topic, and I probably have more than my share of trying to get information on operating expenditures, even getting to the point of, is operating expenditures within this board's lane to take a look at? Seemed like it was a struggle. And, you know, I think that the staff has done a lot of work since the initial presentation in October, but that budget did go from $24 million to 16. And I think in one of the December meetings, Mary Helen had raised a question about whether or not all the $24 million expenditures were necessary and sufficient for the district, and the answer was yes. So I'm trying to balance what the role is with the board versus what staff has to do. And I would like to focus, and I think that Steve has taken the correct approach in what do we need, and as James said, what do we need? What do we think is sufficient for the operations of the district? And honestly, I think that number is somewhere between the $12 million that Eric pointed out in the 16.6 that was presented, which gets us fairly close. And then what I'd like for future discussions to focus on is what information do we need around the operating expenditures to be able to take this out and sell this to the councils that we represent in order to get agreement for collecting the fees. What information do we need in order to sell this to people on the GO bond, that we have sufficient but not too much operating expenses to support the capital expenditures? And that's kind of where I'm trying to put my focus onto, rather than on digging into the weeds of what changed between the October proposal and the this current proposal. So I appreciate the effort that Steve has undertaken to make that more of a board directed initiative. And I hope that clarifying and having some discussions at future meetings about what is essential for the information the board to have to fulfill its role is going to be critical moving forward. So I have more to say, but I don't want to take up more time than I already have. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Seth. If no one objects, can we just go a few minutes over? I want to make sure Emerald gets her comment in. Would that be okay with everybody? Great, thank you very much. Emerald?
Hi, thanks everyone. I've been listening from my drive. And it's been a really good discussion to listen to. I appreciate the items that are moving into the parking lot. I think those are substantive and important discussions, particularly the one about compression. I hear the concern, and I think that we need to have a shared understanding of the implications and potential solutions around that. So I'm interested in that discussion as well, just for my own understanding. I will say on the port's behalf that we are comfortable with the 16.7 number. We believe that the district is saying what they need to operate. And it's possible too that number is small in places. So I just wanted to convey that we are comfortable with that number. And if folks here are not comfortable with that number, we should just get specific about what number is comfortable and why, and what the implications of that loss would be against that 16.7 number. So I'm with Steve Fancher in that we have to make these decisions sequentially and not get too far ahead of ourselves. So if today's discussion is really about, is that number right? I just wanted to convey that based on our conversations with staff and consumption of the material, we believe that it's right. And the parking lot items are important too. So thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll turn it over to Jim, maybe to close out the meeting, Jim and Lori, to see if there's anything else we need to do. I do want to just close my part by saying thank you for everyone's comments. Emerald, I think you said it well. I think the parking lot will serve us well. I think whether we're talking about a variety of risk here. I mean, Eric Molander's talking about the risk of running out of money. I think Seth's talking about the political risk of being able to understand things well enough to sell it. And Councilor Rittma is talking about things like fairness. We're doing our job here. So I just want to acknowledge everyone for your contributions today. Jim, Lori, do you want to close us out with anything?
I would just say thank you very much for this discussion. I appreciate all the engagement, and I've taken a lot of notes, and I know Wendy is too. And so we're going to reconvene with Steve to flesh out the parking lot. And Mary Helen, you asked earlier, where is that thing and how do you see it? And I'm going to figure that out and let you know. We have some ideas. We're not fully baked yet, but our objective is to make that very transparent and readily available to you all, and to have all your staff experts weigh in on all these questions so that you get a thorough answer. And so with that, I think we have some really specific follow-up work that we need to get started on, and we need to schedule adequate time for you guys to continue this conversation. So we're going to really work hard to do that. And I just want to say thanks again, because this is the kind of feedback that I think is going to allow us to bring back products for you that answer your questions. So I just appreciate your time and the intent that you're bringing to clarifying all these things. It's super helpful.
Well, thank you about the parking lot, because literally I couldn't go to a parking lot because I can't ride in a car yet. So there's certain things that just can't happen. And I kind of liken it to this. It's like, I want to go to a parking lot, but I can't. So that's why I asked about the parking lot. And I just want to thank Seth for noticing that I asked a question about 24 million and it was 16 million. And I didn't want to get into the details of what changed. And then, so that's the reason. So thanks, Seth, for hearing what that was and keeping me from not going off on details. So.
Super. Well, I'll close it out by saying everyone have a good afternoon, stay cool. And just a special thank you to Lori for all the preparation and all of the energy that goes into presenting to everyone today. Thank you.